everyone. Welcome to the December 2024 edition of the Idaho Department of Labor's Labor Market Insights series. My name is Lindsay Trombley, and I'm the Public Information Specialist at the Idaho Department of Labor and your host today. Today, labor economist Sam Wolkenhauer will discuss how Idaho's economy is showing levels of growth. So with that, I'm going to give the floor to Sam and let him get started.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. Since it's December and we're wrapping up the year, our goal today is pretty much to give a holistic overview of how Idaho's economy progressed over the last year. And we're going to look at really how the economy has cleared the challenges that it's faced in recent years, and maybe some of the challenges that are going to linger with us. So, before we begin and dive into the content, a sort of general note that the last 5 years have been very difficult for the American economy on the whole. We, of course, know that this started with the COVID pandemic, which led to an enormous spike in unemployment in 2020 and a recession. And then this has been followed by several years of persistent inflation, and of course, the rising and high interest rates that accompany that as the Federal Reserve tries to bring price growth under control. So when you take COVID, the pandemic, and then the aftermath in the form of inflation holistically, it's been a very choppy several years for the American economy. And so kind of what we want to look at is as we finally emerge from this period of turmoil, really, how has Idaho done in terms of weathering that storm? So we're going to jump right into this. We'll briefly touch on inflation. This really isn't an inflation-centric presentation, but it's important to understand that we did see a pretty strong spike in inflation in 2021 and 22. And that has really come down. So this is inflation as measured by the personal consumption expenditures price index. You don't need to really care about the technicalities of that. Just suffice to say, this is really the measure of inflation that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, looks at when it's trying to determine monetary policy. And you can see that it's finally getting down pretty close to the 2% level that they've been targeting. So, in other words, as this comes back down to 2%, we can say that we're really beginning to rise clear of the inflation problem. Maybe we're not fully out of the woods, but we can definitely see the exit through the trees. And so we feel like we've threaded this needle. So when you take the pandemic in 2020 and then this multi-year period of high inflation, it's definitely been a choppy few years for the American economy. So our big question is, how did Idaho do? How did we fare trying to drive through all this? And the answer in a word is really remarkably well. Well, I guess remarkably well is two words, but you catch my meaning. So this is total non-farm employment in Idaho. This is really a remarkable graph. Okay, you can see the pandemic in 2020. You can see the very large drop off of employment. We had a large number of layoffs associated with the early months of the recession and the pandemic. But then this begins to climb. And not only do we recover all of the COVID job losses very quickly, but we return to our pre-pandemic growth trend. And one of the things that's really remarkable about how Idaho has done is that not only did we fully recover from the pandemic very quickly, not only did the economy continue to grow and create jobs through the last several years of inflation and rising interest rates, but we pretty much continued to hit all of the growth targets and the growth trend line and the projections that we would have had before the pandemic. So, in fact, if you superimpose the trend line on here, as we're doing right now, uh, this is really extraordinary. In a sense, it looks like a straight line up to the top right corner of the graph. And you can see that within a year of the pandemic, Idaho had returned to the trend line and continues to cling to that trend line very, very closely. So, in other words, if you were to just kind of put your hand up over the screen and cover up the pandemic year, if you covered up 2020, you would really have no inkling that anything had ever even happened. So, Idaho bounced very hard off of the bottom. We got a big burst of growth coming back out of 2020. We return to our growth trend. And so the fact that we're clinging so tightly to the trend line, we continue to hit these growth projections, shows us that on a top line level, Idaho's economy has really done extraordinarily well coming out of the pandemic, and we continue to see strong job growth, and that's something that we expect to continue to see into the future. So even bearing in mind that these have been a choppy several years on a macroeconomic level, Idaho's labor market continues to be extremely strong, creating jobs, sustaining jobs, empowering the state as we continue to grow. So it's really hard to oversell just how extraordinary this is, how tightly we've clung to our projections and our growth line, even with everything that's been trying to wobble us and knock us off. So really exceptionally done here. And we see this also on the payrolls side. This is Idaho's rolling 12-month, we would just call it total payrolls. Essentially, what that means is the total amount of covered wages paid out in the state over the last 12 months. You can see that this continues to grow, and in fact, it even begins to accelerate its growth in the middle of 2020. So Idaho's economy has been remarkably robust in recent years. We continue to create jobs at the expected pace. We continue to see incomes and wages increase. And so on a top line level, if you're just looking at total employment, total wages, Idaho's economy is remarkably strong and has done very, very well weathering the storms of the last few years. Now, just to give a little bit of context on this, I like to look at the unemployment rate. Now, of course, we know that the unemployment rate does wobble and vary month to month, so it's probably best not to fixate too much on what's the exact reading in a given month. But if we look at the long-term trend, what we see is that Idaho's unemployment rate has been at or near historically low levels for many years now. The long-term average unemployment rate in the state is 5.6%, but over the last 8 years, even with the COVID months taken into consideration, it's averaged something about 3.5 percentage points. So we've seen a sustained period of very low unemployment in the state, and that is, of course, represented in this historically low unemployment rate. Now, if you're looking at this graph and you're kind of dialing in on the last year or so, you probably do notice that the unemployment rate has trickled up a little bit over the last year or so. So it's probably worth asking what's going on there when you see the unemployment rate increase by a little over a percentage point over that period of time. So why is Idaho's unemployment rate rising? And the answer is not an increase in layoffs, lots of people losing their jobs. The answer sort of lies in Idaho's growth on a population level and the growth of the labor force. So I'll show you what that looks like. In October of 2023, so you wind it back a little over a year, we had an adult population of 1.5 million, of whom about 61% had a job and roughly 2% were unemployed. Okay, so most Idaho residents were either employed or out of the labor force, very little joblessness. In the years since then, we've of course added residents. We understand that Idaho is a net growth state, that our population continues to grow. But what we see is that most of that population growth is trickling into the labor force. So of the new residents that we've measured, right, only 10% of those are out of the labor force. The majority are going into the labor force, and about 15% of those people are still looking for jobs. Okay, so you can see that the mixture is sort of what's going on with the population is different among new residents than existing residents, in other words. And this is what has caused the unemployment rate to trickle upwards. So we do have more people that are unemployed in Idaho than we did a year ago, but the reason for that isn't because existing Idaho residents are losing jobs. It's because we have new residents entering the state, new entrants into the labor force, and there is a percentage of that population that's still looking for work. Okay. So in other words, we could say the increase in the unemployment rate is not due to people losing jobs. It's mainly due to new entrants into the labor force who are still looking for work, still conducting their job search behavior. And that's why the unemployment rate has trickled up a little bit. But if you look at people losing jobs, that number is very, very low. So if you look at initial claims would be, people who are laid off and file a new unemployment claim. That number is still hovering down at record bottoms. So we really don't have any increase in people losing jobs, spikes in unemployment claims. That really isn't there. Certainly nothing compared to the huge spike in claims that we saw with the pandemic. You can see that enormous spike where it jumps up to over 50,000 people. We don't have anything like that right now. We really have no elevated unemployment activity in the state. And if you look at the percentage of Idaho's labor force that's claiming unemployment benefits, that is very, very low. It's still well under 2% at this point. So even though the unemployment rate has trickled up, that is not due to existing Idaho residents losing their jobs in large numbers. That activity is still very low by historic standards. So we do have the unemployment rate trickling up, but it's mainly due to growth in Idaho, new residents looking for work, and some of them have not been able to find the right job for them so far, so they're, unemployed, but they're not claiming benefits. We do not see a big spike in benefit claimants. So when we look at Idaho's labor balance and we try to get a sense of what's the balance, what's the status of the labor market, there's a few things that we can look at. We can set up a sort of supply and demand construction of the labor market. And the best way to measure the demand for labor is just to look at open job postings. How many open positions do we have in the state? We had a large run up in the number of job postings in Idaho after the pandemic. Okay? And that is associated with the fact that you did have a lot of layoffs during the pandemic. And then as the economy really kicks it back into gear, employers are posting those jobs trying to rehire people. Okay. So a lot of the job postings that we saw post-pandemic weren't necessarily new jobs being created. They were essentially pre-COVID jobs returning, right? So we did have a big spike in job postings, jumped up to about 80,000 unfilled jobs in the state, which is a very substantial number. And we've done a pretty good job filling those. So that has returned down to somewhat more palatable levels, closer to about 40,000 unfilled jobs in the state. But what we see is that the number of unfilled jobs in Idaho still vastly exceeds the number of people claiming unemployment benefits, and it is greater than the total number of unemployed residents. Okay, so the labor market has balanced itself out somewhat in recent years, but this is still a tight labor market. We certainly don't have any sort of massive surplus of labor. We don't have large numbers of unemployed residents that are just ready to plug in and fill all the jobs overnight. This is definitely a tight labor market, but it has softened somewhat from 2022. So this sets up kind of what we want to understand here about the state of the economy, which is that the labor market was abnormally tight, particularly in 2022. 22 was the year where inflation peaked. It was the year where job postings peaked. It was really the year where the economy was feeling the strains of trying to return to normal after the pandemic. And you can see that in really all of the metrics here. So, for example, if we look at something on the national level and we look at job openings, we see once again 2022 is an abnormally tight year for the labor market. Almost 12 million unfilled jobs nationally. We also saw a big run up in voluntary quits. Okay, and quits are an interesting measure. So that's the black line on this graph. Quits are an interesting thing to look at because they're sort of a proxy for how strong workers think the labor market is, right? Because a quit is different from being fired, different from being laid off, different from retirement. A voluntary quit is when you leave your job essentially with the intention of looking for or taking another job. So more people are apt to quit their jobs voluntarily when the labor market's really strong, when they have other options. You're obviously much less likely to quit your job when the economy is poor and you really don't have a lot of other options. Quits also reached all-time highs in 2022. Again, an indicator that the labor market was very tight. There were more unfilled jobs than there were workers to fill them. And so this led people to essentially shop for new jobs, hop around, and be more mobile in the labor market. And when we look at all of these indicators, we see the same pattern. Record highs in 2022. Again, it's the same in Idaho. Record high job openings in 2022 and gradually coming back down to earth. So if you're looking at this on the short term and you just look, oh, well, it was really high in 22 and it's been coming down, you might think, okay, is the economy souring on us? But when you look at the long-term context, what we really see is that most of these indicators are going back roughly to where they were before the pandemic, right? We see this also with wage growth. Wage growth, again, same pattern holds. 2022, you get a record high level of wage growth. It's steadily coming down as the labor market normalizes, but it's coming down again back towards those pre-COVID levels. So we have the same pattern emerging, and it tells us essentially this. 2022 was an abnormally tight year for the labor market. The labor market was, in many ways, we would even say dysfunctional. It was out of balance. There were not enough workers to fill all the jobs. And we're slowly seeing the throttle come down on this. And we're seeing these indicators return to the stable kinds of levels that we saw before the pandemic. So when you see these lines come down, naturally there may be some alarm bells going, oh, wage growth is coming down, open jobs are coming down. You know, does that mean the economy is turning sour on us? But we really don't see any evidence of that. So again, on the national level, same real pattern as Idaho. We don't see a big spike in unemployment claims. We don't see a big spike in layoffs. Essentially, the reason those indicators of labor market strength are coming down is not because the economy is tipping into a recession. It's essentially because we're getting our pre-COVID economy back, right? And that's the big takeaway. That's kind of the headline lesson that we want to take from these graphs is that all the indicators of labor market tightness are softening, but they're softening back to pre-pandemic levels. So, in a nutshell, we seem to be getting the labor market that we had in 2018 and 2019 back. And that's a good thing. The labor market was not functioning in a particularly happy way in 2022. Very, very hard to fill jobs. And so that extreme tightness is starting to dissipate, and we're really returning to our pre-pandemic economy. And you saw this most clearly in Idaho's case in the fact that we've really returned to that pre-pandemic trend line, and Idaho just continues to climb along at the growth levels that we were seeing coming into the pandemic. So the overall lesson here seems to be that Idaho in particular has really threaded the needle on this. We survived the pandemic, bounced back from that. We've gone through several years of inflation, but the labor market is really starting to hum along at the healthy kind of balance that we saw before COVID. Okay. And really that's kind of the ideal situation that we'd like to be in to really thread the needle on that, land from all that turmoil, and be back humming along at our trend line. That's really where we like to be, and we think we're going to see continued growth in Idaho in the coming years. Okay, so that's kind of the first half of the presentation. A holistic look at the labor market. We see that we're on a stable growth path. We don't really have any signs of distress or impending doom in the labor market. We really see a healthy labor market returning to where it was before COVID. And now we want to kind of ask the question, okay, so if we've threaded the needle on inflation and the pandemic, and we're really settling back into a normal sort of labor market, what are the issues that are going to stick with us? What are the long-term things that we need to be, considering? And so having sloughed off the pandemic and the inflation, there are long-term things that we want to be aware of that are going to create labor market tightness. And so we need to understand in the long run, labor force growth in the country has been in a pretty steady state of decline. Okay, so this is the annual growth of the labor force. You can see that it peaked right around 1980 when labor force was growing in excess of 2% per year. And it's been in a state of long-term decline ever since then. So at this point, we're talking about several decades of persistent decline in terms of how fast the labor force is growing. And so this clearly is a phenomenon that predates COVID, right? Since we're running this all the way back to 1960 on this graph, this is clearly a long-term issue. And so the question now is, having kind of made it through these short-term problems with the pandemic and inflation, let's sort of reframe our minds to think about the long-term issues that we're going to continue to deal with. And chief among them is this slowing of the labor force growth and the demographic shift that we're going through. So now we're going to be looking more at these long-term issues. Okay. And chief among them is the demographic shift that we're going through in the country. Okay. So we know that family size has fallen pretty precipitously in this country. In the early 1960s, the average family still had well over 3 children on average. And that declined precipitously through the 1960s and 70s, and then it's been declining even further over the last decade. So we understand that a sort of minimum family size, on average, is necessary to sustain the population, to keep the population stable. That number turns out to be 2.1 children per family on average. And we've been below that essentially for the last 50 years, right? And so this begins to build up demographic pressures that you eventually begin to feel. And we're definitely beginning to feel those right now. Now, when we look at something like this, the birth rate, it's easy to think of this as a sort of sterilized, abstracted demographic indicator. Okay. But this has really concrete implications for the country. And chief among those is that when family size is declining, you actually end up with fewer and fewer children with each passing year in the country. So if you look at America's youth population, you actually see a pretty clear tapering pattern where you have significantly more teenagers than you have children of the middle school ages, and then you have even fewer children in the elementary ages, and then fewer children still in the preschool population, 4 and under. So we actually end up in a situation where we have almost 1 million more 15-year-olds in this country than we have infants. Okay, so when you see something like the birth rate graph, I know that it seems like a very abstracted sort of demographic indicator, but it's really not abstract at all when you think of this in terms of a smaller and smaller youth population with every passing year as a result of fewer children being born in the country. Now, it's easy, again, to look at the youth population and think, well, this is probably mostly a matter of concern for schools and, other institutions that cater to children. But this also directly impacts our workforce because, as you can well understand, every year that bar full of 18-year-olds is the new entrance into the working age population. And you end up with fewer and fewer young people aging into the labor force with each passing year. And this is occurring at the same time that we have more and more retirees with every passing year. So this graph shows you an estimate of the total number of retirees in the country. And it's really crazy to think about the fact that we already have more than 20 million more retirees than we did at the turn of the century, right? And that number is increasing every day. And you can clearly see that around the year 2010, this line has a shift. So from 1960 to 2010, the country averaged a little over 500,000 new retirees every year. But then in 2010, something important happened, and that is that the baby boomers, the largest generation in the American workforce, began to retire. And so this line has a little bit of a kink or a bend in it. And at 2010, you have a slope shift. And from that point on, you average 1.3 million retirees per year. So right around the year 2010, the number of people retiring annually nearly tripled as the baby boomers began to reach retirement age. So we end up with a little bit of a math problem beginning to mount in this country. And that math problem is pretty simple. The number of retirees, the number of people retiring every year is accelerating. And yet the number of young people aging into the labor force to replace them is deteriorating. It's declining over time. And that, it turns out, is a math problem that's really, really hard to solve. And it ends up giving you a problem something like this. So this is a graph that I took from a Congressional Budget Office report. You can understand, of course, that this would be very important to our friends at the CBO, tasked as they are with things like the actuarial solvency of Social Security. So they're, of course, very dialed in on this. And if we look at the composition of America in terms of working age versus retirees, you can see that we're in the middle of a pretty profound shift. Okay, so in 1954, we had almost 6 working age Americans for every retiree in the country. That began to decline slowly at first, but by now that number has fallen, almost 50%. So we're now at about 3 workers per retiree, and that's going to decline even further as we really feel the bite of baby boomer retirements. So that by 2054, we're only going to have about 2 working age citizens for every retiree. And it can seem like, well, this is a pretty long run. This is a 100-year graph, but that's a really profound change to happen to a country in that span of time. So essentially, right around the time the baby boomers were being born, America was a young country predominantly made up of working age residents. So when the baby boomers were being born, 6 workers per retiree. By the time the millennials, the boomers' children, are retiring, you're talking about 2 workers per retiree. So pretty much within the lifespan of 2 generations, a parent-child generation, the ratio of workers to retirees is going to fall by, roughly 2/3. That's a really profound, dramatic shift in the country. And we have to understand very clearly the country cannot function the same way at these differing levels. Everything about the country is fundamentally shifting, not least of all the way the labor market functions, right? Because this ratio doesn't just speak to who's paying into Social Security and tax revenue and things like that. This also affects your ability to find nurses, and other critical workers that staff our hospitals. This affects your ability to find workers to build homes, supply essential services. Everything that we consume and need in this economy is more and more constrained by the fact that there are just fewer workers relative to the retiree population in the country. And in fact, we've really already reached this tipping point. We're now firmly in the point where, absent immigration, the American labor force is really not growing much at all. So if you wind it back to 2020, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually conveniently chops up labor force into native-born and foreign-born workers, over the last 5 years, the native-born labor force has grown by less than 1 million people, right? Growing by less than 1 million people over 5 years combined represents basically a rounding error in terms of growth. Meanwhile, the foreign-born labor force has grown by about 3.5 million people. So we're now firmly in the phase of America's demographic cycle where the vast majority of our labor force growth comes from foreign immigration. The implication here is essentially that we've reached the point where let's call it America's organic demographic resources, do not support a growing labor force. Okay. And absent immigration, we really have negligible, statistically insignificant labor force growth. Now, this is not to imply any sort of particular policy prescription about immigration. Clearly, that would not be appropriate for a state labor economist to be implying, but it is important to know what the math is. And the math is pretty simple. Most of our labor force growth comes from foreign-born workers, and the sort of organic demographic resources of the country are largely tapped out. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, okay, what about Idaho? Idaho does not seem to have any problem with growth. If you live in Idaho, have lived here for any significant amount of time, you've clearly seen the growth in many of our urban areas. We understand that this is one of the fastest growing states in the country. Most years, it is the fastest growing state in the country. There is a perception that almost all of the growth in Idaho is retirees. That is really not true. So when we look at the population growth in Idaho, the blue line is our growth for the past decade, and the black line is our projected growth for the coming decade. And you can see that while we do have significant growth in the 65 and older population, the largest share of our growth has been in the working age group, so 15 to 64, and we even have growth in the youth population, which is not something that you can say for all the states in the country. There, as we saw, there are fewer and fewer children being born every year, so you can't take it for granted that the under 15 population is growing. In Idaho, it is. Okay, and so this growth, and particularly the fact that we do have some balanced growth where there is significant growth in the working age population, this gives Idaho the opportunity to escape some of the worst demographic damage that we're seeing in other parts of the country. So, the best way to illustrate this is to look at population pyramids. These are really the totalizing way of looking at demographics. If you're not familiar with them, they're actually very easy to read. So each bar is the population of a 5-year age group. You have female and male on opposite sides, and this shows you where the population is allocated. So anywhere that you see a bulge, where the graph is bulging out, that means the population in that age group is oversized relative to the rest of the population. So when you look at this, the first thing that stands out is there's really two bulges. One is clustered around the year 65, that's the baby boomers. One is clustered around the year 30 to 34, that's the millennials. So those are our two largest generations. That's why the graph bulges out where they're located. So to sort of summarize the math problem we've been hinting at, it's right here. We have almost 63 million people that are going to be retiring in the coming decade or so. But if you look at the youth population that's expected to replace them, there's fewer than 60 million in those age groups. So even if the work habits of these generations were the same, and based on the teen work rates right now, they do not appear to be, perfectly substitutable, we would be short several million people on the exchange of generations here. There's simply not enough young people in the younger cohorts to power labor force growth in the absence of immigration, as we saw. So you're short several million people on this exchange in the best of circumstances. But of course, Gen Z thus far, based on the teen work rates, does not appear to have, particularly desirable labor force participation, so you might be short even more just based on the fact that Gen Z doesn't seem to have ideal work rates. Now, Idaho, and this is where it gets interesting, Idaho's population pyramid looks radically different. You can clearly see what is the biggest population in Idaho in terms of single 5-year age block. It's the 15 to 19-year-old population. That's very different from what we saw on the national scale, where the population actually begins to cave in with the younger population. We also do not have nearly as pronounced a bulge of millennials or baby boomers. So this is a younger, somewhat more balanced population. And essentially, the reason for this is we've had a large number of families move to Idaho to raise children. And this ends up giving us an oversized teen population in the state of Idaho. This is very, very important because this oversized youth population is Idaho's sort of ticket to continued growth in the labor force. This is not the case for every state in the country. We do need to understand that Idaho is a relatively young state that has had very robust growth relative to the rest of the country, and it's essentially given us a demographic resource that we can capitalize on that other states do not have. The other thing that we want to note is that Idaho's boomer bulge is not as pronounced here. The baby boomers do not stick out as obviously on the population pyramid in Idaho as they do in other states. Okay, so we do have a much more smoothed and balanced demographic profile. And this is a demographic resource that is going to be really, really important for Idaho in the coming decades. Now, we don't want to think that this means that demographics don't matter to us, that we've escaped this issue entirely. As you can clearly see, our under 5 population is much smaller than our 5 to 9 population, right? So we're not immune to falling family sizes, declining birth rates. One of the more interesting things about Idaho is that even with all the population growth that we have had over the last decade, the total number of births in Idaho is basically flat, right? So you're essentially getting the same number of births in the state out of a larger and larger and larger population. Okay. So we're not immune to falling family sizes. We do see the tapering of the youth population here in Idaho, but that large teen population is a really important demographic resource for us that gives us some hope and some opportunities that other states do not have. So when we look at our projection for Idaho's population, this is sort of a unified population pyramid. So we're not chopping it up by gender. This is total population. The blue bars are our projection for the total population in that age group. And then the black bar, the black portion of the bar is how many workers we think the state is going to get out of that, relevant population. So when we look at where Idaho's workers going to come from, a large share of our labor force growth is going to come from the fact that we have a growing young population. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity, right? It's good to have an oversized youth population. It's a very valuable demographic resource that is the main reason we think Idaho's labor force is going to continue to grow. But it also means that you have to retain the youth population, right? If Idaho leaks a large number of young people, say they go to other states to go to college, and then they stay in those states to work, it is going to reverse our labor force situation, and it will make it very, very difficult to fill the demands of our labor force. So we have this population, but we have to retain them. This is essentially the demographic logic behind a program like Launch, is it's saying that we have a demographic resource in the state in the form of a really large teen population. So we want to find ways to plug them into Idaho's education system, plug them into Idaho's economy so that we don't lose this resource to other states, right? Because this is really the demographic engine that's going to power Idaho's labor force growth and economic growth into the future. So we can really see the clear demographic logic here that falls cleanly from the math. So really quickly, the thing that I want to note about this is that demographics have a couple of things that we need to understand. They're very, very powerful, right? I like to equate demographics to a glacier, right? Because it moves slowly, right? This is a graph that very slowly heaves its way up. We age it 1 year per year. So when you look at a demographic pyramid like this, you're looking at literally an entire lifetime uh, uh, of the individual as they move up and up the graph. So we understand that demographics move slowly. The working life of an individual is many decades, so it takes a long time for these shifts to be felt. But like a glacier, they really are what determine the shape of the landscape in the long run, right? So understandably, things like pandemics and inflation and trade wars and all of these things that we see in the news, we understand that these are important. But in the long run, it's the glacier that carves out a valley, cuts the face off the side of a mountain, right? And that's what demographics do. They move slowly like a glacier, but they really are what determine uh, they're what determine the long-term economic trajectory of countries. So we don't want to confuse their slow pace for unimportance. They're very, very important, even if they sometimes move so slowly, we really don't notice that they're moving at all. The second thing that we have to understand about demographics is they're highly, highly unlikely to ever be wrong, right? There's very little ambiguity in demographic data. We have a perfectly constant rate of aging. We all age at 1 year per year. Okay? And what that means is we're really not likely to be wrong about what's happening with the age structure of the population. If you have a certain number of 15-year-olds in the state, you know with pretty good certainty how many 16-year-olds you're going to have the next year, right? So demographics are both unambiguous, they have a really, really low error in terms of how we understand them. They move slowly, but they're very, very powerful. So understanding where our demographic vulnerabilities, and in the case of Idaho, our demographic opportunities lie is really, really important. So, based on the time, I think it's fitting, apropos, that we just kind of briefly recapitulate what we've talked about here, and then we will transition to the Q&A, and we should have 15 minutes or so for the Q&A. So, we don't want to deny that we've gone through 5 years of pretty significant economic volatility. The pandemic produced the largest spike in unemployment that the country's really ever seen, record high levels of unemployment that suddenly pivoted as the economy got back on track, pivoted to an unbelievably tight labor market. So within a couple of years, just to give this some context, in 2020, you had all-time record high levels of unemployment. And in 2022, you had record high levels of open, unfilled jobs, right? So you went from, in essence, the absolute poorest, weakest labor market in history in 2020 to the tightest, hottest labor market in history in 2022. And amid that, you had the inflation story straining households. And yet, when you look at Idaho, really we aced this test. You come out of this with the total growth trend right on track, continuing to create jobs at the projected pace, very, very low levels of unemployment, very, very low levels of joblessness, and a continued growth path into the future. So 5 years of pretty extreme volatility, and yet Idaho seemingly was hardly volatile at all. We continued to grow at the expected rate. So now we have a situation where a lot of our labor market indicators have softened. Open jobs coming down, quit levels coming down, wage growth coming down, but they're coming down relative to an abnormal high, right? So we have to understand this softening not as the economy turning sour on us, but really returning to pre-pandemic baselines. Okay. And if you look at things like job openings and wage growth, these things seem to be settling down towards where they were in 2019 on the eve of COVID. So the overall message here is we really did well going through these 5 years of volatility, and our reward is essentially we get our old economy back. We get a lot of our labor market indicators returning to those nice levels that we had before the pandemic. So having cleared these long-term issues, we now need to, sort of reframe our time frame and what we're thinking about, and remember that we do have long-term structural things that we need to be aware of. And chief among those is the aging of the country. The United States is firmly transitioning into being a culture with mass retirement, an economy with mass retirement, and that does have profound implications on the labor market. Thankfully, however, Idaho is better positioned to deal with some of these issues thanks to our relatively young demographic profile, our oversized teen population. So we have demographic resources that will allow us to cope with this, much better than many other states. The trick is we have to capitalize on those demographic resources by retaining the population that we have. And if we can do that, Idaho is well positioned to continue to be a growth state with a stable and prosperous economy into the future. So on that note, I think we will welcome Lindsay back in and we will conduct the Q&A portion.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for that wonderful presentation. As I said in the beginning of the webinar, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type those in the Q&A, and I'll pitch those questions to Sam. We don't have any questions at the moment, but I do have a few for you, Sam, myself. Um, my first question, this is really a lot of interesting information, but what did you find most interesting or surprising in your findings?
I think the thing that's most counterintuitive to people is that Idaho has actually a very young demographic profile. I think there's a perception that Idaho is somewhat akin to Florida, where we're just a destination for retirees who want to take advantage of the quality of life that we offer and all the recreational opportunities. And I think people think that we're becoming a sort of Florida North, because Florida is a country where, or a state where the majority of the growth really is 65 and older. And I think that the balance of the growth that we've had and the fact that we actually have a relatively young demographic profile runs contrary to what people expect to see, kind of based on the popular understanding.
Okay. We're starting to get some questions. An attendee is wondering, do you have this data broken out by region specifically? I know you have kind of US data and Idaho statewide, but do you have this data broken out by region?
We do publish data regionally, both population and labor market indicators. Most of it is easily found on our website, and we have a talented staff of labor market economists who can help you if you have a specific data request.
Awesome. Another question we have, what effect does rising mortgages and rents have on the employment outlook, especially considering the drop in wage growth?
So, sort of theoretically, when mortgages are more expensive, when it's more expensive to move, it reduces labor market mobility because people can no longer afford to maybe they're sitting on a nice mortgage that they took out in 2018. They can't afford to move and, refinance at the new higher rates. So it reduces the mobility of American households, makes it much harder for them to move, which means it's harder for the labor market to clear because workers can no longer afford to move between regions. Idaho has continued to grow over the last few years. So even with the higher mortgage rates, we have seen continued population growth in the state. So we haven't yet seen that the new reality in the labor market has stopped people from moving to Idaho.
Okay. Another question we have is immigration aside in Idaho, what does the Idaho labor force growth look like?
So Idaho's labor force growth in large part is due to people moving to the state. However, most of the migration to Idaho is residents from other states. It's not international immigration. So the Census Bureau publishes, they call it their components of population change, and it looks at births, deaths, residents moving from other states, and then international immigration. And well over 90% of the immigration into Idaho is from other US states. It's not from foreign countries. So immigration is important to Idaho's economy, but clarifying that in our case, it's domestic migration from other American states, not foreign countries, that predominantly brings new residents here.
All right. Another question we have, what are some of the benefits of Idaho returning to pre-pandemic economic status?
Sure. So when we talk about labor market tightness or how hot the labor market is, you have two extremes. On one extreme, you have mass unemployment. Okay. And that's obviously bad, right? We want people to have jobs. On the other hand, however, you have a labor market that's so tight that you have severe labor shortages where employers just cannot find people to fill positions. Okay, so we can think of extreme labor shortages and mass unemployment as the opposite extremes of the labor market. And ideally, you want to have a balanced labor market where pretty much everybody that wants a job has a job, but there's still a little bit of slack to the point where if you need to hire someone, there's actually somebody to hire, right? So a balanced and equilibrium labor market is desirable because it balances the needs of employers and job seekers. And keep in mind, it's not about employers uh, just for their own sake, but that's how we function. That's how our lives function, right? When you have severe labor shortages, it means really long waits at hospitals and urgent care clinics because there's no nurses, right? It means that if you need a plumber, um, you have to wait days and days and days to get one out to your house, right? So we want balance so that people have jobs, but employers still have the ability to hire when they need to. And in 2018, 2019, the labor market was much more balanced than it has been in recent years because we went through both extremes. 2020 was mass unemployment. 2022 was a pretty severe labor shortage, and we'd really like to be somewhere nice and cozy in the middle.
Another question we have, which I think is actually a great question. Will the tight labor market ever ease up? And then, kind of in connection with that, they're asking, will productivity increase via technology make a difference in this?
So the demographics seem to dictate that the labor market is just going to be much tighter structurally long term than it was, say, 50 years ago. That's kind of the inescapable conclusion. Obviously, automation, technological substitution can help, but so far, productivity growth in the country is pretty flat. Okay, so we really are not seeing some sort of astonishing spike in productivity as a result of robotics or AI. That may come. Um, the technologist could answer that much better than an economist because as an economist, when I look at the productivity numbers, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you don't see anything in there that's flashing at you, wow, we have a productivity revolution in the country. So that's still a speculative question for the future. It may happen, be great if it happened, but we aren't seeing it yet.
All right. Another question we have from the chat. What strategies is Idaho employing to retain our younger population? What is the largest sector growing in Idaho?
So strategically, I mean, a lot of this is going to be, driven by local initiative employers and educational institutions. On the state level, you can clearly see that the launch program is kind of calibrated to try to capitalize on our relatively large youth population. Um, and just trying to get young people plugged into Idaho higher ed and Idaho employers as soon as possible so we don't leak them into other states, essentially. And then the fastest growing industries in Idaho, it's cliched, but it's a healthcare economy. Construction continues to be a very strong performer. It's the industries that you expect that are the fastest growing.
Um, there's another question relating to, the economy and projections. Um, this person's wondering, do we have anything broken out by remote work? How does this impact Idaho's projections, considering, many people live here in Idaho, but work for another state?
Yeah, so the statistical tools for measuring remote work are kind of still being dialed in. They aren't really refined. The American Community Survey does ask people about their work arrangements, commuting status, work from home status. That shows a slight decline in remote work. It seems like remote work really peaked in 2021 and 22 and has been declining a little bit. We don't yet have a really strong, what I would call a headline data series on remote work because it's a relatively new phenomenon. So we aren't necessarily full antenna up in terms of how to measure that. But there are some surveys that get at it, and it seems like it's declining a little bit.
Okay. Another question we have is what is the Idaho breakdown on foreign-born workers versus native workers in the workforce?
Yeah, so I kind of answered this a little bit earlier. Based on the data from the Census Bureau, almost 95% of Idaho's new residents in recent years have been from other US states and not foreign countries. So Idaho, Idaho is definitely a break from the rest of the country. Um, in that most of our growth is driven by US residents from other states. It's not even not primarily, it's international immigration to Idaho is really not very significant on a statistical basis, at least according to the census data that we have.
All right. I actually have a few questions for you too. Another question I had was, what are the implications for employers and job seekers as Idaho's economy returns to its pre-COVID normal?
Yeah, so what we're seeking is that balance, right? We want a situation where everybody that wants a job is able to find one, but there's still a little bit of slack and a little bit of churn so that uh people are able to find workers when they need them. And increasingly as the country ages, that's going to come in the form of getting plugged into young people and kind of snatching them up right as they enter the labor force. Um, but that balance is what we're seeking, and it definitely seems like we're returning to a more balanced state, something more like an equilibrium uh, in Idaho, which is what we want to see.
And then, in your opinion, I mean, I've heard the term recession from people. In your opinion, do you think that a recession is in the near term, like possible? Why or why not?
Recessions are always possible because often they happen in response to random things that really aren't economic in their nature at all. I mean, in 2019, nothing about the economy suggested that there was going to be a recession. But we had one, not because there was something wrong with the economy, but because of, you know, some guy in a wet market ate a bat or whatever. Well, I actually can't remember how it started at this point. But, respiratory virus wasn't on my bingo card as an economist, but it definitely affects the economy. So we never want to say a recession's impossible because this is a world filled with randomness and chance. But the fundamentals of the economy, particularly in Idaho, are very strong. We have payroll growth, we have job growth, we have very low joblessness, and we have continued population growth. So, never say impossible, but nothing in the bones of the economy right now suggest recession.
And then my last question for you, with birth rates kind of declining, and kind of looking at your projections, how long do you think the labor force bracket will be between the ages of 20 and 34-year-olds? Is that sustainable for Idaho?
So, right now, our teen population is actually a little bit larger than our population in its 20s. So theoretically, the working age group there in the 20s will grow in Idaho, provided we have retention of that youth population. And that's what's unusual about the state. In most states, there are quite a few fewer teenagers than there are people in their 20s. So most states are going to be looking at a drop off in that population. That population should grow in Idaho, assuming we have a retention of those age groups.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, for your expertise and insight on this topic. It looks like we're about at time, so I just want to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, January 21st, 2025, the new year. Labor Research Supervisor Craig Shaw will give an overview on the 2025 economic outlook of Idaho's labor market. To register for that webinar and others in the new year, please navigate to Labor's calendar of events for more details. We'd also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared to job seekers, employers, but also includes free access to labor market information available at lmi.idaho.gov. Thanks again, Sam, for presenting today, and thanks for everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.